Pultec are among the most beloved EQs in the audio world and have been for decades. They've been emulated by countless hardware and software companies who, for the most part, have stayed true to its original design. It's been described with just about every audio buzzword you can think of, from
colorful, silky,
smooth, buttery, bite,
confusing, subtle, tone of its own,
punchy lows,
so fat,
and my personal favorite, musical. Now, I'm not making fun of anyone who uses these terms. I use them too, and while abstract, I do think they are quite accurate in describing the almost magical effect that the Pultec imparts on a sound. But with so many more modern and feature-rich options available, what makes the Pultec so enduringly popular? And why should you or I use one? I believe the answer to this question lies in demystifying the design and history of the Pultec EQ so that we can better apply our critical listening skills when deciding when and how to use it. First, let's talk about the history of Pultec. Pultec is short for Pulse Techniques, which was an electronics company founded in 1953 by Eugene Schenk and Oliver Summerlin. One of the products that they designed and built, which later made them famous, was the EQP1A, a program equalizer used by DJs in radio studios. A program EQ is just an EQ that was used to adjust the tonal balance of songs that were being played on the radio. If you can imagine being a DJ in the 1950s and having a program of songs that you're playing that day, and each of them are being played off of different physical vinyl records, and they are all recorded by different bands with different arrangements and probably in different studios, there's going to be some dramatic difference from song to song in terms of tonal balance. So a program EQ was just a way for the DJ to maintain a consistent tonal balance throughout the program so that listeners on the radio could have a pleasant listening experience. Now, passive EQs were very popular for this use case because they introduced less distortion and fewer artifacts than their active EQ counterparts. Pultec's flagship product, the EQP1, was no different from other program EQs. It was also passive, required no additional power to be used, and didn't introduce distortion or artifacts like an active EQ would. But what made it stand out from other options on the market was its LC circuit design, as opposed to the RC circuit design used by other program EQs. LC filters had a much more natural roll-off than their RC counterparts, which made them sound more transparent and natural. This was desirable for program engineers who were trying to make more gradual adjustments to the tonal balance of the songs they were playing on the radio. The EQP1 was fully passive and therefore required no power to be run, but Pultec updated their design to the EQP1A to include a tube power amp section in order to solve the problem of volume loss common with passive EQs. The EQP1A quickly became popular in recording studios and has been a staple in the recording industry since. So how does the Pultec EQ actually work? Well, let's start by addressing a couple of misconceptions about passive EQs. The first being that passive EQs are unable to boost a frequency and only attenuate it. Therefore, if you are boosting at a certain frequency, all you're doing is attenuating everything else and then using the power amp section to make up the gain. This isn't actually the case, and we know this because the original EQP1 design had no power amp. This leads to the next misconception about the power amp section. The tubes in the power amp do nothing for the EQ. The EQ section of the Pultec is entirely passive. So how does Pultec's EQ section actually work? Well, it uses a collection of inducers and capacitors to shape the overall EQ rather than boost or attenuate a specific frequency. When you run a signal into a Pultec, it gets split into three different circuits: the low-end circuit and the two top-end circuits. When the signal arrives at any given circuit, it is split again between two main components, the inducer and the capacitor. Now, what do these do? Well, they're passive components, so they don't actively do anything to the signal. They simply let it pass through them. But they have their own properties that impart a certain effect on the signal as it passes through. Capacitors, for example, are really good at letting the higher frequencies of the signal through while resisting the lower frequencies. And inversely, the inducers are really good at letting the lower frequencies pass through while resisting the higher frequencies. I might have that backwards. I'm not an electrical engineer, but that's the principle. So when the signal is split and passes through these two components, it gets summed up again, and the EQ curve is just the cumulative result of these two signals coming back together. Let's take a look at a Pultec to see how it works. Okay, so here I have an emulation of the EQP1A by Universal Audio, and below it I have an EQ curve analyzer, so we can see exactly what the Pultec is doing as we use it. Now, technically, the Pultec has two bands, a low band that covers 20 to 100 Hertz and a high band that covers 3 to 20K. However, it has three different circuits. It has a low-end circuit that can both boost and attenuate, a high-end circuit that can boost, and a high-end circuit that can attenuate. And the reason that the high-end is separated into two different circuits is because one of them is a bell boost and the other one is a shelf cut. Let's take a look at the low end circuit first. So you'll notice here we have separate boost and attenuation controls. And if you've never looked at a Pultec before, this might seem very weird. Normally you might expect to see something more like this, where you have 0 in the middle, and if you want to attenuate, you go left into your negative values and you go right into your positive values. But that's not actually how our Pultec works. So remember, each circuit is made up of a collection of capacitors and inducers. The capacitors are good at letting high-end content through, and the inducers are good at letting low-end content through. So when they're both at 0, we have an equilibrium between the inducer and the capacitor that results in a flat EQ curve. But as soon as we start boosting, we are making the inducer work harder. And what is the inducer good at doing? Letting low frequencies through and resisting higher frequencies. Meanwhile, the capacitor isn't doing anything. So when these signals pass through their respective components and are summed back together, the cumulative result is this shelf boost. Now, the same is true if we increase our attenuation control. What are we doing here? Well, we're making the capacitor work harder. So what's the capacitor good at doing? Letting high frequencies through and resisting low frequencies. And when these two signals pass through the respective components and are summed together, the cumulative result is a shelf cut. Now, what's really interesting about the Pultec EQ and what really makes it magical and even musical is the relationship between these components, between these inducers and capacitors. Because we have separate and independent controls for boosting and cutting at the same frequency, we can get some very interesting EQ shapes. Now, the original engineers did not intend for the Pultec to be used this way, and it even said in the manual not to do this, but of course, people had to. So this is when we discovered the Pultec trick, or the low-end trick, or the Pultec punch trick. So let's start by boosting our low end. And as I said, we can attenuate at the same time. Now, you might think that if I start bringing up my attenuation knob, that I'm simply going to cancel out the boost that we've made. But because these are two independent signals running through their own components in parallel and then getting summed together, we don't actually get a cancellation effect, we get something entirely different. So let's see what happens. So as you can see, as I start making the capacitor work harder and increase that attenuation knob, what ends up happening is we get a dip in the mid-range. And if you are experienced at all with mixing, let's say drums, for example, you know that it's a very pleasant sound and a very punchy sound when we increase our low end and then decrease the lower mid-range. And the reason this effect happens, and the reason that these don't cancel each other out, is because they are two independent signals, and they're simply being summed together, and this is what they end up summing to. And this is what I really think makes this EQ musical. It's this relationship, this dance between the circuits and the components within the circuits that end up creating something greater than the sum of its parts. I maybe am romanticizing it a bit, but this is precisely why we call this sort of equipment musical or magical, because it is so imprecise, but at the same time produces a very pleasurable result. Now, the high end isn't nearly as interesting, but we'll still go over it. We've got a boost here, and we can also control the bandwidth of that bell boost with this knob here, as well as which frequency point we are boosting at. And then in addition to that, we can attenuate at a frequency using a shelf from 20, 10, and 5. Now, actually, while this is technically a 2-band EQ, this actually does kind of cover your entire frequency range. For example, if I want to increase the low end of a song without making it too muddy, I simply boost it here, and then I attenuate some of those muddier low end frequencies, right here, right at 300 hertz, right? And I can kind of do something similar in my top end. Let's say I'm boosting at like 12. So let me just boost here. But now I'm introducing a lot of high mid-range, and it's starting to sound a little harsh. Well, then I'll just bring this down to 5, and I'll start increasing my attenuation. And now I start to bring that upper mid-range back under control. And as you can see, the resulting curve here is very similar to the kind of curve that you'll see engineers put on their mix bus. So if you've seen maybe like Nolly's videos, it's in his Creative Live course, where he puts an EQ on his mix bus that looks very similar to this. And all we're doing is turning the knobs in one direction and letting the circuits and individual components of those circuits interact with each other to produce a result. Now, there's one more reason that people love using Pultecs on, say, their mix bus. Engineers often like to put the Pultec on their mix bus because it simply adds something to the sound, be it more harmonic richness or thickness, vibe, whatever buzzword you want to use. But what exactly is it doing to impart that sound? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so I'm running a sine wave at 100 hertz through a signal chain, and I have one Pro Q3 that is listening to that signal, and you can see it here. And then I'm going to boost it with another instance of Pro Q3 that is instantiated in front of it. And the reason I'm going to use a Pro Q3 is because it should not impart any kind of analog characteristic to the signal. So as you might expect, as I boost at 100 hertz on this EQ, you can see it getting louder on this EQ. Look what happens when I simply run this signal through the Pultec. You get all these harmonic overtones added to the signal. Let's see what happens when I boost. You get all these additional overtones. And this is what we talk about when we're talking about thickness or harmonic richness. It's this increase in actual harmonic content in the signal. Now, of course, this is just a sine wave, but you can imagine the effect on a more harmonically complex instrument like a guitar or a piano or an entire mix. You are adding harmonics to them as well, which results in a thicker, richer, more exciting and vibey sound. So it's a real thing. Now, as fun as it is to talk about all this, let's take a listen to how it sounds on a mix bus. I'm first going to play a song here without the Pultec so we can hear how it sounds. And I have tonal balance control pulled up as well so we can visualize what we're hearing. Bear in mind, there's no other processing on this mix at all, just the Pultec. Okay, so as you can see, there's a distinct lack of sub and lack of top end here. And the Pultec is perfect for treating those two frequency ranges. Let's start by treating the low end. Okay, that definitely did the trick, but now we've got some muddiness. So let's use the Pultec trick to clean up some of those low mids by attenuating at the same frequency. Now, it looks like my attenuation is happening a little bit more in the around the 1K range, so maybe let's bring this back to like 60 or even 30. That's sounding much better. And now let's take care of the top end. Usually on a mix bus, I like to go straight to like 12K and have a pretty wide bandwidth. This lets me be really aggressive with it without ever making the mix sound too harsh. And we've brought in a lot of those high mids now, so I'm going to try the same trick by attenuating at 5K, and let's just see what happens. So by doing just a couple of simple moves on the Pultec, we've taken our mix far, far closer to the end result. Well, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my take on Pultec and the EQP1A, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. If you or someone you know is in need of any kind of music-related services, such as mixing, producing, mastering, help with songwriting, I will leave my email and a link to my SoundBetter profile in the description below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.